Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl. Chapter 1. Here Comes Charlie. These two very old people are the father and mother of Mr. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa Joy and Grandma Josephine. And these two very old people are the father and mother of Mrs. Bucket. Their names are Grandma George and Grandma Georgina. This is Mr. Bucket and this is Mrs. Bucket. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket have a small boy whose name is Charlie Bucket. This is Charlie. How do you do? And how would you do? And how would you do again? He's pleased to meet you. The whole of this family, the six grown-ups and little Charlie Bucket, live together in a small wooden house on the edge of a great town. The house wasn't nearly large enough for so many people, and life was extremely uncomfortable for them all. There are only two rooms in the place altogether, and there was only one bed. The bed was given to the poor old grandparents because they were so old and tired. They were so tired that never got out of it. Grandpa Joy and Grandma Josephine on this side, Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina on this side. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket and little Charlie Bucket slept in the other room, upon mattresses on the floor. In the summertime, this wasn't too bad, but in the winter, freezing old draughts blew across the floor all night, and it was awful. There wasn't any question of them being able to buy a better house or even one more bed to sleep in. They were far too poor for that. Mr. Bucket was the only person in the family with a job. He worked in a toothpaste factory where he sat all day long at the bench and screwed the little caps on the top of the tubes of toothpaste after the tubes had been filled. But the toothpaste cap screwers never paid much money, and poor Mr. Bucket, however hard he worked and however fast he screwed on the caps, was never able to make enough money to buy one half of the things that so large a family needed. There wasn't enough money to buy proper food for them all, and the only meals they could afford were bread and margarine for breakfast, boiled potatoes and cabbage for lunch, and cabbage soup for supper. Sundays were a bit better. They all looked forward to Sundays because then, although they had exactly the same, everyone was allowed a second helping. The buckets, of course, didn't starve, but every one of them, the two old grandfathers, the two old grandmothers, Charlie's father, Charlie's mother, and especially little Charlie himself, went about from morning till night with a horrible empty feeling in their tummies. Charlie felt it was worst of all. And although his father and mother often went without their own share of lunch or supper so that they could give it to him, it still wasn't nearly enough for a growing baby. He desperately wanted something more filling and satisfying than cabbage and cabbage soup. The one thing he longed for more than anything else was chocolate. Walking to school in the mornings, Charlie could see great slabs of chocolate piled up in the shop windows, and he would stop and stare and press his nose against the glass, his mouth watering like mad. Many times a day, he would see other children taking bars of creamy chocolate out of their pockets and munching them greedily, and that, of course, was pure torture. Only once a year on his birthday did Charlie Bucket ever get a taste of a bit of chocolate. The whole family saved up the money for that special occasion, and when the great day arrived, Charlie was always presented with one small chocolate bar to eat all by himself. And each time he received it, on those marvelous birthday mornings, he would place it carefully in a small wooden box that he owned and treasure it as though it were a bar of solid gold, and for the next few days he would allow himself only to look at it but never to touch it. Then, at last, when he could stand it no longer, he would peel back a tiny bit of paper, wrapping at one corner to expose a tiny bit of chocolate, and then he would take a tiny nibble just enough to allow this lovely sweet taste to spread out slowly over his tongue. The next day he would take another tiny nibble, and so on and so on. In this way, Charlie would make his six-penny bar of birthday chocolate last for more than a month. But I haven't yet told you about the one awful thing that tortured Charlie, the lover of chocolate more than anything else. This thing for him was far, far worse than seeing slabs of chocolate in shop windows or watching other children munching bars of creamy chocolate right in front of him. It was most terrible, torturing thing you could imagine, and it was this. In the town itself, actually within the side of the house in which Charlie lived, there was an enormous chocolate factory. Just imagine. And it wasn't simply an ordinary enormous chocolate factory either. It was the largest and most famous in the world. It was Wonka's factory, owned by a man called Mr. Willy Wonka, the greatest inventor and maker of chocolates that there has ever been. And what a tremendous, marvelous place it was. It had huge iron gates leading into it and a high wall surrounding it, and smoke blanching from its chimneys and strange whizzing sounds coming from deep inside it. And outside the walls, for half a mile around in every distance, the air was scented with the heavy, rich smell of melting chocolate. Twice a day on his way to and from school, little Charlie Bucket had to walk right past the gates of the factory, and every time he went by, he would begin to walk very, very slowly, and he would hold his nose high in the air and take long, deep sniffs of gorgeous chocolate smell all around him. Oh, how he loved the smell, and oh, how he wished he could go inside the factory and see what it was like.